A biting wind swept through the city streets, rattling the windows of Jane's small studio apartment. Inside, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows across a cluttered desk covered with crumpled papers, empty coffee mugs, and a laptop. Jane sat motionless, staring at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard but refusing to move. The words felt trapped, tangled in her mind like a bird caught in a net. The weight of failure pressed down on her chest like an anchor. For years of rejection letters, dismissive critiques, and countless nights wondering if she had made a mistake pursuing her dream of becoming an author. Yet here she was, still trying, still hoping. She glanced at a framed photo on her desk of her parents, their faces lined with the weariness of a life spent working tirelessly. Her father's favorite saying echoed in her mind. "A strong spirit can weather any storm, Jane. Remember that." She sighed and leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the city lights outside her window. The city seemed alive even at this hour. Sirens wailed in the distance, punctuated by the occasional honk of a car horn. Jane often found herself drawn to the chaos outside. It was a stark contrast to the silence within her apartment, a silence that sometimes felt deafening. She thought about the path that had brought her here. Growing up in a small industrial town in the UK, she had always dreamed of a life beyond its narrow streets and gray skies. Her parents had worked tirelessly to provide for her, sacrificing their dreams so she could chase hers. She promised herself she wouldn't let their sacrifices go to waste. Her move to Toronto in her 20s had been an act of bold defiance against the odds. With little more than a suitcase and a folder of unfinished manuscripts, she had stepped off the plane, determined to carve out a space for herself in a world that often felt indifferent. The early days had been exhilarating, filled with the promise of new beginnings. But as the rejections piled up, the initial thrill gave way to a gnawing doubt. One cold January evening, Jane found herself scrolling aimlessly through her social media feed when a video caught her attention. It was a short clip of an artist from Chicago speaking about perseverance. His voice was calm but firm as he shared his story of spending 7 years honing his craft before anyone noticed. "The world doesn't owe you anything," he said. "But if you owe it to yourself to keep going, then don't stop." The simplicity of his words struck a nerve, igniting a spark that had almost faded. That night, Jane opened a new document on her laptop and began to write. She didn't overthink it. She let the words flow, each one carrying a fragment of her frustrations, hopes, and dreams. The story was about a phoenix, a creature that rose from its ashes, stronger and brighter than before. It wasn't just a story. It was her story, told through the lens of fiction. She worked tirelessly, pouring herself into the narrative. Her sleepless nights were filled with the tap-tap of keys, and her days began to blur into a haze of coffee and creativity. Her apartment became a sanctuary and a battleground. The sound of construction outside her window became a rhythm she worked to. The mess on her desk grew as she pushed herself further, her focus unshaken. Each chapter felt like a step forward, a triumph over the doubts that had plagued her for years. She didn't know if anyone would read it, but for the first time, that didn't matter. She was writing for herself, for the small part of her that refused to give up. Months later, Jane sent her manuscript to publishers, bracing herself for the familiar sting of rejection. Days turned into weeks, and then one morning, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding. The first line made her breath catch. "We're thrilled to publish your novel." It was from a small publishing house in New York. Jane reread the email several times, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, Her dream felt within reach. The day her book was released, Jane stood in a local bookstore, staring at a shelf filled with copies of her debut novel. The cover depicted a phoenix with its wings outstretched, flames dancing around it. She reached out and picked up a copy, holding it as if it might disappear. Memories flooded her mind. Her father's encouragement, the endless nights of doubt, the artist's words that had reignited her spirit. In that moment, the weight of her struggles transformed into something else entirely: pride. But success didn't come without its challenges. As her book gained traction, Jane found herself navigating the complexities of a world she'd only dreamed about. Interviews, book signings, and social media buzz became part of her daily life. Though exhausting, these moments were reminders of how far she had come. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Jane received a message from a reader. It was a single paragraph, written by a young woman in Vancouver who had been on the verge of giving up her own dream of becoming an artist. "Your book saved me," the message read. "Reminded me that falling doesn't mean failing. Thank you for showing me that it's okay to rise again." Jane sat in her apartment that night, holding her phone and reading the message over and over. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The struggles, the sleepless nights, the countless times she had questioned herself. And now, here she was, not just living her dream, but inspiring others to chase theirs. Months passed, and Jane's life continued to evolve. Her second novel was underway, and her days were now filled with a mixture of writing and connecting with readers around the world. Invitations to literary festivals and workshops poured in, allowing her to meet others on their creative journeys. One particular encounter stood out. A young man from Manchester shared how her book had pushed him to finish medical school despite overwhelming odds. "Your words lit a fire in me," he told her, "and reminded me why I started in the first place." Each story she heard fueled her passion. Jane realized that her success wasn't just about her own achievements. It was about creating ripples that touched the lives of others. Her dream had expanded, becoming something greater than herself. She began mentoring aspiring writers, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to persevere. On the anniversary of her book's release, Jane hosted an event at the same bookstore where she'd first seen her novel on the shelves. The room was packed with readers, some clutching well-worn copies of her book, others holding notebooks filled with their own stories. As she spoke, Jane felt a deep connection with the crowd. She wasn't just an author anymore. She was part of a community, bound together by a shared belief in the power of resilience. One night, as Jane sat by her window, gazing at the city that had become her home, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The failures, the moments of despair, the times she almost gave up, all of it had shaped her into the person she was now. She realized that an unbreakable spirit isn't about never falling. It's about always finding the strength to rise again. It's about holding on to hope even when it feels out of reach. As she prepared for bed, Jane glanced at her laptop, where a new story was already taking shape. She smiled, knowing that her journey was far from over. Her story was proof that dreams, no matter how distant, are worth fighting for. And as the city lights flickered outside, she felt a quiet determination that no rejection could ever extinguish.